Welcome to the Commonwealth Club. I'm George Hammond, Chair of the Humanities Forum, which is working together with the East Bay World Affairs, Commonwealth Club World Affairs group, to bring you Dr. Michael Baker. He's a surgeon, and he worked in the Navy and was a Rear Admiral. So that puts him in a very interesting position to talk about this subject. How the military is going to react to its current unusual uses, maybe. Let's put it that way. So, Dr. Baker, looking forward to hearing this again.
Great.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you for that very kind introduction, and thank you all for coming tonight. I want to give a shout out to one of my shipmates for the longest commute. Captain Driscoll in the back flew in from Wyoming for this talk. So, it tells you something about the bonds of those who serve in uniform. We might not agree politically or whatever, but we look out for each other. And several others are here. Mr. Ryan over there. We were in Cambodia in 1996. So, kind of interesting to find these guys after decades. Anyway, we're going to have an interesting talk tonight. I'm going to go through a lot of stuff of which I'm not really an expert, but I'm kind of an amateur historian. So I'm going to ask you to do a couple things. So first of all, think about silencing your cell phones, and if you're a college-age kid, put it away. And I'm going to go through kind of what I'm going to talk about. The big question for us today is, would U.S. troops fire on civilian demonstrators if they're so ordered? That's a very complicated question. There's constitutional and historical aspects. And so we're going to talk about the 10th Amendment of the Constitution, which establishes the military. We're going to talk about the Insurrection Act, the Posse Comitatus Act. You probably never heard of these until troops wound up in L.A. There's kind of a huge civil-military divide. I'm going to bring that in. We're going to talk a little bit about who's in the military today and where they come from, because I think that's important. And then we're going to decide, are they going to obey illegal orders? For the most part, I'm going to ask you to hold your questions to the end, unless it's something like really urgent, like you have to go to the restroom, and you can just go. You don't have to ask me. So it's not like a high school class. So most importantly, not only did I feature some of the veterans who are here in the room. How many veterans are here? How many guys we got here served in uniform? We got a pretty good sprinkling here. I like to feature those that I also served with. You met a couple. There's going to be a couple on the video. And I love old movies and old TV shows and documentaries. And I put them in here wherever I can. And this is one of them.
I'm a surgeon.
I am not a historian by training, nor am I a constitutional lawyer. But I will do my best.
I will do my best. So let's talk about the Constitution. Congress has the role about the military to raise and support armies, to provide and maintain a Navy, to make rules for the regulation of the armed forces, including, a budget and stuff like that, and to declare war. That's kind of been overlooked recently. We'll talk more about it. The scholars who look at this stuff, about the control of the military, civilian control is absolutely crucial. The armed forces are the state's instrument to provide our security. They must be under the control of representatives of that society, which is Congress. Not in control of anybody else. And it's the very essence of democracy. We don't have a king. They're not under control of the king, we hope. So the civilian control, has to be by the people, not part of them, Congress. They have the oversight to declare war, to do the budget, a lot of those things in normal times. And they ensure the military hopefully will operate in the pursuit of society's interests, not some single individual's interests, as we're seeing occasionally. There's also a little bit about the militias in the Constitution. This is important because, we had a lot of militias back before we had, actual real army. We still have them. It provides for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, reserving to the states. This is important. The appointment of the officers. So today, the National Guard of the state of California, the officers are appointed by the governor. Same is true in the other states. So the militia today would be like the National Guard. To call forth the militia if we have to, and suppress insurrections and repel invasions. That's really their role. It's not guard duty, spreading mulch around the trees, and we'll get there. So in the 10th Amendment, I always crack up when I try to read some of these phrases in the Constitution, some of the other legal documents. Power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, are reserved to the states, respectively, to the people. Primary authority and responsibility rests with local and state governments, and only if the emergency exceeds the state's ability to respond will the federal government get involved. This is really important. There's a couple times when it can be overridden. We'll talk about that. And the two crucial laws that you've been hearing about, the Insurrection Act of 1807 is huge. The Insurrection Act, the president can deploy military troops or federalize the National Guard to suppress civil disorder, insurrection, rebellion. We'll go into it a little more detail in a minute. The other big law that's important is the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878, which limits the powers of the government in the use of military personnel to enforce domestic policies. What an interesting law. Haven't been hearing much about it lately. So the Insurrection Act, the president can deploy military troops, federalize National Guard. Civil disorder, insurrection. What's that mean? Rebellion means attacking the government, trying to change the government. Provides a statutory exception of the Posse Comitatus Act, which limits the use of military personnel under federal command for law enforcement. Let me tell you, I was in uniform for a long time. We don't do law enforcement. It's not our role. The role is to close with the enemy and destroy them, or to function to help during emergencies, when asked. Police work, parades, it's not our thing. They do it better in China anyway. So the Insurrection Act, the president must publish a proclamation. You can't just say, hey, I think there's an emergency in LA, I'm sending the troops. You got to publish a proclamation. You got to order the insurgents to disperse if they're really insurgents before you can invoke the powers of the act. So that would be the normal way it was done for many years. And it's a statutory exception of the Posse Comitatus Act. It authorizes the president to do this in three circumstances we'll see. There's three important areas. They're all really important. You can use it to suppress that insurrection or rebellion or to protect a state from an invasion or domestic violence. Domestic violence is not the kind in like your bedroom or your kitchen. It's the kind that, you saw in the streets when there's riots, and we'll have an example of that. Upon the request from a state or territory to enforce federal authority, we're having trouble maintaining the law, please bring your National Guard or troops. And this one's really important. My favorite, to protect the people's constitutional rights, the president may use the military to suppress demonstrators if the state is deemed to have denied its citizens equal protection of the law. This is a really, really important one. It's kind of my favorite, as we'll talk about. In domestic unrest, the military has been used for hundreds of years, over 100 times, starting in 1794 when George Washington put down the Whiskey Rebellion. God forbid we should have a shortage of whiskey if you're in the military. That's a big deal. But, there was the Pullman strike, the miners' strikes during World War II. There was Detroit race riots. We'll talk about some of these. Other examples, when civil rights were taken away, Southern governors refused federal court orders for school desegregation, which to this day I watch these videos and my heart breaks, and I wonder what country I'm in. So when local and state authorities refused to protect civil rights marchers in Selma, Alabama, which is a horrific documentary, it doesn't require a request or even the permission of the governor. The president can say, hey, you're doing something you shouldn't do, and we're going to fix it. But he can send in the armed forces. So it doesn't require any kind of a request from the governor. So if you invoke the Insurrection Act, and there's a lot of legalese, there's an insurrection at the request of the governor. Anyway, I'm not going to read all this because the big one is at the bottom, which says the state is deemed to have denied its citizen equal protection of the laws. And that's really, really important. It doesn't have to do with rebellion or violence. It's stuff that makes me cringe. And here's an example with Governor George Wallace blocking the door. Some of you are probably old enough to remember this.
I have with me here proclamation signed by the President of the United States, which calls
Told that guy to turn off his cell phone.
to cease obstruction to justice in this state. Proclamation, Governor, was signed by the President within the last hour. Two students who simply seek an education on this campus are presently on the campus. They have a right to be here, protected by that court order. They have a right to register here. It is a simple problem, and those students who remain on this campus, they will register today. They will go to school tomorrow, and they will go to school at this university at this summer session. The university has indicated its willingness to accept them.
So they called in the National Guard to enforce the president.
President Kennedy was forced to federalize National Guard troops to remove Wallace. Civil rights leaders were pleased to see the president finally use the bully pulpit for their cause.
But they have a right to expect that the law will be fair, that the Constitution...
On June 12th, the Wallace-Kennedy confrontation was front-page news.
So, a couple other examples. 1957, President Eisenhower sent federal troops to Little Rock, Arkansas, because 9 black students wanted to enroll in a local high school in their neighborhood, right? 65, President Johnson sent the regular Army and National Guard to protect the civil rights marchers who had been attacked during the prior march on their way from Selma to Montgomery. Can't show you all these documentaries. I can give them to you if you email me. I'll send them to you. 1992, we had the Watts riots. President Bush acted under Section 331. At the request of the governor, we need federal help. You're going to see this is not like Los Angeles. So this is George Bush Sr., the smart one.
There are 3,000 National Guardsmen on duty in the city of Los Angeles. I will use whatever force is necessary to restore order.
In April of 1992, President George H.W. Bush federalized the California National Guard to help local law enforcement regain control in Los Angeles during the LA riots. The unrest stemmed from the police beating of Rodney King, which was caught on camera. The officers involved were acquitted, and there were fires, looting, and destruction throughout the city. The National Guard is often used during domestic emergencies, overseas combat, counter-drug efforts, and reconstruction efforts. It can be activated by state governors or federalized and activated by the president. Before 1992, presidents activated the National Guard domestically for mostly civil rights-related incidents, like the integration of Little Rock Central High School in 1957 and one of the 3 Selma to Montgomery, Alabama marches in 1965. During the riots, nearly 10,000 National Guard troops were deployed. In 6 days, more than 60 people died, more than 2,000 people were injured, and damages were estimated at over $1 billion.
So a lot different than what we saw in Los Angeles this summer. I mean, this needed the National Guard to help law enforcement. The other law, the Posse Comitatus Act, which is actually originated in 9th century England, came about with the creation of the Office of the Sheriff, which is an English term, signed in 1878 by President Hayes, and you're going to meet one of his relatives in a minute, which is kind of fun. The Posse Comitatus and common law is the power of the county to deputize people, to mobilize people, and to work with the sheriff to suppress lawlessness or defend the county. And the first guy you're going to see is a highly decorated war hero who's an amazing guy named Audie Murphy. And the second guy is President Hayes' relative, but also a war veteran.
Early today, Judge Whitaker and I wired the United States Marshal of the Arizona Territory and...
Audie Murphy.
You're looking directly at a brand new Deputy United States Marshal.
It's a fight, boys, a real fight. But if we win, it'll be Tombstone's last fight.
We're with you, Star.
Told you I love old movies. So Audie Murphy, a highly decorated guy who held off like half the German army single-handedly, amazing guy. And Gabby Hayes, I mean, both veterans, but slightly different styles. So the Posse Comitatus Act, theoretically, is supposed to limit the power of the federal government in the use of the federal military and domestic law enforcement, domestic policies. It consists of one long sentence, which I won't read, but basically this huge long sentence says, you can't really use the army to execute the laws. You'll be fined, you'll be imprisoned, and it goes on for another page. But it's considered a real cornerstone of the American legal tradition, and up until now, it's never really been an issue or a question very much, but we'll talk about some exceptions and problems with it. It reflects a belief that the military involvement in domestic law enforcement can be dangerous to civil liberty. What a thought. It's a key safeguard against executive overreach. We don't see any of that. And it limits the potential for a military tyranny, like a coup, because, they're controlled by Congress, right? So it allows the president to call up forces when the states can't handle it, like you saw in Los Angeles, to suppress the violence, or when it was opposition to citizens' constitutional rights. In 2013, we had a directive from the Secretary of Defense, who was actually qualified for the position, to prohibit the use of the military for domestic law enforcement. I don't know where that directive went, but it's not being done. I want to take you through some history now because it actually concerns, believe it or not, the veterans. I'm going to fast forward to something called Department of Defense War Plan White. War Plan White began in 1919 to deal with domestic insurrections. They wanted to get the military ready for problems in this country. I don't know how they knew it was coming, but World War I had ended. Vets were coming home, and they started planning. It gave the Army broad temporary powers. Federal troops who were assigned to the task of domestic insurrections were in no way restrained by any statute. That's an interesting legal statement. You guys can do whatever you want. So along comes the bonus army. In 1930s, we start having the Depression. Why did we have a bonus army? Well, in 1924, Congress voted to give the veterans of World War I a bonus for every day served in the military during World War I. Payable in 1945. I'm not sure why they threw those extra, 21 years in there. I guess they figured there'd be a lot less guys to pay. It's good fiscal policy. But 1929, the Great Depression, right? By 1932, there's unemployment, there's hunger, there's homelessness. The country is in bad shape. The vets needed and wanted some money. They needed help. So the bonus army, former Sergeant Walter Waters organizes a band of 300 veterans to march on Washington. And as we've seen at some of these demonstrations recently, you get one in one town. Next thing you know, there's similar groups in other cities. And after a while, by May, there were 20,000 veterans that went to Washington. Mostly took the train and the bus and stuff like that, and they arrived in the Capitol. They wanted their bonus certificates redeemed because they were starving, they were homeless, they were unemployed. They built a camp across the Potomac River in Anacostia back when a lot of that was open space. Most of them returned home when the Senate actually rejected their request. We'll talk about that. But several thousand remained in the Capitol with their families because they had nowhere to go. Why should I go back to wherever when there's no job? I lost my home. Might as well just hang out here, right? So Hoover's response, being a law and order, President sensitive, I don't know what to call him, orders the Army, War Plan White, clear the marchers from these empty buildings and campsites and get this stuff out of here. You're going to meet some historical figures. You're going to be a little shocked by what they do. Army Chief of Staff at the time is Douglas MacArthur. Brings in the active duty Army. The bonus Army had conducted itself with decorum. They were unarmed. Their vigil was quiet for the most part. Sometimes they would get in front of the Capitol and do slogans, but, they didn't light any Waymo vehicles on fire or anything like that. There was no violence. There was no vandalism. So a quick video.
In 1932, Washington was under siege. The Capitol was surrounded by over 10,000 unemployed veterans of World War I from all over the country. The marchers had stayed, camped out in central Washington.
Near midnight, the 72nd Congress adjourned. Congressmen left through back doors and underground tunnels to avoid confrontations.
They still do.
The situation had come to a head. The president ordered the evacuation of the veterans from downtown Washington.
And now you bring in the troops.
When MacArthur moved his troops to the affected area, and he adorned himself in his dress uniform, along with his major aide, Dwight D. Eisenhower.
The force stepped off at 4:30 p.m. More than 200 cavalrymen spread out across Constitution and Pennsylvania avenues. Behind them came 400 infantrymen, followed up by tanks and armored vehicles.
The cavalrymen, one of whom is Major Patton.
The cavalrymen draw their sabers. Can you imagine?
The soldiers donned gas masks.
So, interesting historical figures. General MacArthur, Colonel Dwight Eisenhower, and Major George Patton, all of whom have some good characteristics, but this is not one of them. The bonus marchers with their wives and children were driven out, as you're going to see. All their stuff was burned. General MacArthur and most of the other senior guys at that time thought the bonus march and the marchers, that this was a harbinger of the Bolshevik Revolution. They thought it was coming to America. All these guys wanted was a little help. We'll talk about that. And the second half of this part of the video, and I edited them a lot, second half breaks my heart, and you'll see why.
And without warning, began hurling gas grenades at the veterans. The troops advanced, some jabbing with bayonets. Marchers were choking from the gas, just like the battlefields in France.
And so they're being forced out of their shacks by smoke bombs and tear gas hurled by the troops who have been called out by the President of the United States.
The veterans did not believe the country for which they had fought would ignore the plight into which the Depression had placed them. Many did not believe that United States troops would take the field against them.
Then troops began to set fire to their wooden shacks. One reporter wrote, "The blaze was so big it lit the whole sky. A nightmare come to life." The president looked out a window of the White House in the direction of the fire, then retired for the night. The morning after the bonus rout, public sentiment took a dramatic turn against Herbert Hoover. If the expulsion needed a human face, it came in the person of Joe Angelo, whose story was published across the nation.
Joe Angelo gets the Distinguished Service Cross for saving Patton's life on the battlefield. The next morning, Angelo comes to the burned-out field to see Patton. And Patton says, "Take this man away. I don't want to see this man."
The BEF was broken up. The men returned to some city or other, there to roam the streets, hopelessly seeking work or to shuffle in bread lines. There they remain, crying examples not of the need for the bonus, but of the need for a new American system.
Yeah, the Joe Angelo story saved Patton's life. Patton doesn't have 5 minutes for him. I mean, that just breaks my heart. But there's a second bonus march. This is interesting. In 1933, they organize a second march. They're still starving. There's still unemployment. They still don't have jobs. FDR's in the White House. He offers them jobs in the Civilian Conservation Corps. Different approach. Most of the group accepted the jobs and took the jobs because they wanted to work, doing anything. And those who chose not to work by the May 22nd deadline were given transportation home. They weren't driven out of Washington, and this is pretty amazing. So different response. One of the great things FDR did, we're going to see one of the ones that wasn't so good in a little bit, and that's coming right up. It's Executive Order 9066. So fast forward to 1941, the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor. Anti-Japanese sentiment around this country is running very high. So my 9th grade teacher tricked me into taking Latin. I needed it for med school. Wasn't true, but I wound up taking a lot of Latin. Inter arma silent leges, probably mispronouncing it. It's been a long time. In time of war, the laws are silent, as we well know. It's the abrogation of constitutionally guaranteed civil and political rights since World War II. The U.S. Supreme Court throws in a surprise. The armed forces removed and imprisoned approximately 110, sometimes 120,000, depending on who you read, of Japanese descent. 2/3 were loyal American citizens. And now we have this business with concentration camps repeating itself. A little bit of history. It's at least rhyming, if not the same. So just a clip about that for those who aren't familiar with this. I can't imagine being told to pack a bag, give up my house, give up my business, farm, whatever, and go to a camp because I'm Japanese. So they built 10 camps.
We still couldn't believe that they could force American citizens out of their home with no reason.
For their safety.
In the meantime, we are setting a standard for the rest of the world in the treatment of people who may have loyalties to an enemy nation. We are protecting ourselves without violating the principles of Christian decency.
Yeah, good try. Great propaganda. The fact of the matter is, I have some family members who were in those camps. Some of their offspring are here tonight. And we didn't imprison any of the Japanese in Hawaii because they were a really important part of the shipyard workforce that put the Navy ships back into battle. So they were okay in Hawaii, but they weren't okay in California. I wish we had a whole lecture about why it happened in California. It's a whole other story. The other thing is, a lot of the young men in the camps volunteered to fight in the war, and they constituted the 442nd Combat Brigade, which is one of the most highly decorated units ever to fight in a war. Since recently, their display at the Pentagon has been erased, which makes me crazy. Well, you know, they're not white, right? And so, whatever. I've got to tell you a little bit, just a second, about Fred Korematsu. He said, I'm not leaving home. I'm an American citizen. I was born here. It violates the Fifth Amendment. The Ninth Circuit said, tough, you got to go to the prison camp. So he went to the Supreme Court, and they upheld it. And he had to go to the camp. He was taken away. And yet there was a Justice Black, even in 1942, who dissented. We have a Justice Black today who's a great dissenter. And he said the exclusion order legitimizes racism. It violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And this guy should not be sent to a camp. He's an American citizen. So, you know, even in those days, sometimes the Supreme Court had their head, you know, where. But so moving along, got a lot to cover here. I want to pull back the curtain a little bit about the chasm between the military and civil society, which is pretty big, and there's a couple of reasons. It's a growing and dangerous divide. A colleague of mine named General Stanley McChrystal told me this about 10 years ago. He said, the greatest threat to the national security of our country is the division within our society. He told me this more than 10 years ago. I was shocked when he said that, but now I kind of see what he's saying, and it's happening, right? The Great Divide has to do with a lot of things. The average person has very little or no interaction with anybody in uniform. There's 20 million veterans now, which is less than 7% of the population that served in uniform. Very few Americans have had a family member who is currently serving or has served. And public knowledge of the media comes from war movies and social media and whatever, TikTok. I don't know what, you know, right? I'm a big fan of war movies, but that's not really the real thing. 7% of Americans have served. So the numbers, if you look at the graph, you like statistics, numbers are going down starting about 1990. But we've always had citizen soldiers. You know, conscription was part of the Civil War, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, Vietnam. We're going to talk about why it's important. Historically, most conflicts were fought by citizen soldiers, by conscripts, by draftees, and volunteers both. And you're going to meet some experts on this.
World War I has trapped Europe in a grueling cycle of slaughter. President Woodrow Wilson needs millions of troops to break the deadlock. But as America faces entering the Great War, the Army numbers barely 200,000.
Woodrow Wilson knows he has to initiate a draft.
50 years after the Civil War, the draft is still such a tinderbox that Wilson avoids using the word.
So Wilson refuses to call it a draft. He refuses to use the word conscription. Instead,
he calls it the Selective Service Act. Let's use a new term. It will make it
the Selective
random.
Service Act of 1917, it certainly made it more equitable. It outlawed purchase and substitution. It established exemptions or deferments for things like medical reasons for ministerial students.
He establishes 4,000 local draft boards that make the decisions. And they decide who goes and who's exempt. Could they be corrupted? Who knows?
The federal government sweetens military service with new benefits for veterans, such as health care and pensions. If citizens serve the nation is honor-bound to pay them back.
Although we know come 1932 it didn't happen. So in World War II, the citizen soldier, we had a new Selective Service Act of 1940, required men between the ages of 21 and 45 to register for the draft. It's now 18. You know, you have to register when you're 18. 50 million men had registered by the time the war was over. 10 million were inducted to the military. 14 million served in uniform. If you do the math, it's 38.8% were volunteers, 61% were draftees. So, you know, almost a third of the force was volunteers, 2/3 of draftees. Need conscripts. But the entire nation was committed. There might be a few of you here old enough to remember this, but everyone had skin in the game. There were the 14 million in active duty uniforms. A lot of people not in uniform were in the defense industry because that gave you a deferment. There were scrap drives. Not very few of you probably know about scrap drives. Kids would go around the neighborhood picking up old hubcaps and crap to turn into munitions. We didn't have enough steel when the war started. The entire nation was on board with rationing. You had a ration card. You could only get so many gallons of gas per week. There were war bond drives because there was no money to fund the war. They were just not prepared after the Depression. People had victory gardens. Everybody was tearing out their lawn and growing their tomatoes and cucumbers so that they had a victory garden. And then after a while, the money problem got bigger, so they started withholding tax. And so a lot of things changed in our culture because of World War II, but everyone was involved at some level. And then came Vietnam, the war of my generation. It was different.
Vietnam. Following through on JFK's call for patriotic service and sacrifice falls to his successor, Lyndon Johnson.
I have today ordered to increase our active fighting forces by raising the monthly draft call from 17,000 to 35,000.
America's leaders commit the nation to war. The American people rally behind their president.
Public opinion was behind the war. The general consensus was we're at war. More people needed to fight the war on our behalf, and therefore the draft is the instrument for that, and that's the way it is.
Remember Dan Rather? Great journalist. But Vietnam was different. There was very little international support. There was declining domestic support. The cost of the war, as always, skyrockets, more casualties than anticipated. And the first anti-war demonstrations started out. And, when that first started, I had just gotten my draft number, which was number 5. And I was on my way to med school, hoping that I could get into med school before they pulled my number, and which fortunately worked out. So I went to college, and I just did my thing, and I didn't pay too much attention. But, we weren't winning. And Mark Twain says, Benjamin Disraeli gives him credit, says lies, damn lies, and statistics. And that's what our government propaganda is all about. It was a gigantic cover-up of the failures. They failed just like the French had failed at Dien Bien Phu and other places. We failed at Khe Sanh. We failed in other places. We were bombing civilians. A lot of it was covered up, but eventually the reporters got pictures and stuff on the nightly news, and you started seeing villages, things happening that shouldn't have happened. And it changed Americans' view of the draft and national service. And, there started to be demonstrations even with former veterans who came back from Vietnam.
While overwhelming majorities support sending troops to Vietnam, a small faction take an unpopular stand against war and the draft.
We're losing 200 a day, maybe more. And these punks here against the United States Army, United States government, that's what you call anarchy and treason going against the United States government.
He's not volunteering, but,
And if you were opposed to the war in Vietnam,
they thought you were unpatriotic, that you were a traitor. It was a terrible thing. So Nixon runs for president, anti-war platform, leave Vietnam with honor. Too late for that, but he does say, I'm going to end the draft, which is, we'll see if it's good or bad. We'll decide.
Nixon wins the election of 1968, but it was a squeaker. And once he was elected president, Nixon almost immediately created a commission to consider the idea of creating an all-volunteer force.
So he establishes the Gates Commission, and the Gates Commission ends the draft, implements the all-volunteer force. Young men, they're right out of their report, young men drafted into military service lack the passion and professionalism of the volunteer. Not true. The all-volunteer military, the AVF, is more in line with the principles of a free nation, and they don't have to have forced servitude. So now they got to go out and recruit in the marketplace. The condition of the U.S. military could never improve unless it was forced to compete in the marketplace. And I love this. You're going to love it too. Remember these?
You're reaching deep inside you, things you've never known. It's been tough, rough going, but you haven't gone alone.
We do more before 9 a.m. than most people do all day.
Hey, First Sergeant. Good morning.
You would never talk to your first sergeant like that. He's now scrubbing stuff in the kitchen, right? It's a great commercial, right? So they fill its ranks. They have improved advertising. They got better pay, more benefits. They recruit more women. A couple more years, they need some new ads because it's starting to falter again.
What are you setting your sights on? And when you see it, will you be ready? Just pick up the phone, dial 1-800-645-ARMY, and you'll get this free DVD. You'll learn about the hundreds of opportunities the Army can offer you. Skills, education, healthcare. Call 1-800-645-ARMY, and you'll also get this free Boonie hat.
Always wanted one of those.
Whatever you're looking for, the Army can help you find it.
They keep trying. You know, they go to Madison Avenue. Yeah, after 9/11, there was a kind of a boost in recruiting. People volunteered. But after a while, they couldn't meet the quality and quantity goals. They kept lowering the standards. They tried to insist on high school graduates with good test scores. What's it called, Jake? The ASVAB that you have to take to be in the military, I think. Yeah. They recruited more women. They tried more pay, enlistment bonuses, retention bonuses. 20 years ago, 2005, they just couldn't get the guys they needed. So they started a new program, remedial education. Interesting. How do you recruit from that declining pool?
The Army is approaching the issue with their Future Soldiers Preparatory Course. It's a 90-day course geared towards helping recruits pass the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery. Officials say the program has a 93% success rate, although there is a general disinterest in joining the military. Other veterans say changing the narrative is pivotal to making military service more appealing to younger Americans.
That said, they do one thing that's really impressive, as you'll see here in a second.
The United States Army is the largest supplier of college scholarships.
You know, and they provide scholarships if you want to go to med school, you want to go to nursing school, dental school. They do a lot of stuff like that to get people, and I think that's brilliant. Didn't have that when I was paying my way through med school, but it's okay. So where do the reserves and the National Guard fit in? What's their role with all this that I'm talking about? Well, they're a cost-effective adjunct to a large standing army. You know, if you have 500,000 active duty troops getting paid, 30-plus days a month, you can have other people who are reserves and National Guard. They get 2 days of pay. They serve 2 days every month and 2 weeks theoretically in the summer, although my career was never anything like that. But that's the way it's supposed to be. You also bring your civilian skill sets and some of your thinking into the military, which is different, which is very important. Your mindset, your skill sets. And, you're one of those citizen soldiers who says, I'm here. I don't want to be in uniform daily, active duty, but I will set aside my personal life and serve if I'm asked to serve. And it's, I was glad I did it. It might prevent the government from pursuing war. A lot of guys who do, the scholarly dives on this say, yeah, maybe, but may also be possible to manipulate it. We might be seeing a little of that right now, of some of that manipulation. President Johnson didn't call up the reserves for Vietnam to avoid public outcry. It was like Woodrow Wilson not calling it the draft. It's like we won't call up the reserves because it was used by many as a VIP safe zone, so the sons and daughters of politicians and wealthy people could hide from the draft. George Bush the Simple was in the Air National Guard for like 12 months, and he avoided being drafted and sent to Vietnam, but he didn't really finish his tour. I don't know how he got out of that. Now the current administration is using it to confront demonstrators, which we're going to talk a lot about. But should we have the draft? When's the draft really appropriate? I'm going to give you Dr. Kennedy from Stanford. He's really knowledgeable
that kind of
about
authority
this.
vested in the government, that kind of capacity to command the lives of citizens is only legitimate in the face of a truly dire threat to the very existence of the country. On the scale of World War II, let's say. I'm not sure World War I really qualifies, as a matter of fact. The Civil War certainly qualified. But absent a threat on that scale, it seems to me that we ought to be very wary about granting the government the right to control our lives down to that level and to that degree.
Interesting. So the military also has interesting demographics today because it's an all-volunteer force. Geographically, it's skewed to the South and the West, as we'll see. South has historically contributed the most recruits. They also tend to come from small towns, rural America, and cities near military bases. It tends to be white, Southern, conservative. Diversity of background, used to be a bulwark against, worrying about civil-military relations. But, now if they're all coming from one place and thinking one way, they identify with the Republican Party. The last time I could actually get a statistic, 6-1. So 6-1 MAGA Republicans. This is older. This is more than 4 years ago. So now I can't get as good a data. But if you look at the map as where they come from, you'll see that the darkest colors along the South Atlantic region, from Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida provide the most recruits, and then across the West, Texas and Kentucky and Tennessee, and then out to the mountain states. And not so many people from the Pacific or the West Central area. So it's kind of interesting. It's very skewed. Are we making a separate warrior class? It represents geographically a small segment, and politically maybe. It's predominantly white males from the South and the West. It's often a family business. There's generational service. A lot of people who are in the military are in because their father, grandfather, the uncle, somebody was in. Might lead to an attitude of elitism or a sense of otherness. So one of the questions for us today, we're not going to answer it right now, but we're going to come to it, is the all-volunteer force, the AVF, truly representative of our country, the way we want it to be? Is the burden of service still borne disproportionately by members of lower economic classes? We'll see. And does it represent our society's values? So these are things we need to think about and talk about when we decide if there's a danger to democracy. Does that elitism and otherness lead to resistance to civilian control? Does it lead to what's called a Praetorian Guard mentality, which is we're here to protect Caesar and do whatever Caesar says we should do? So what's the worry about the all-volunteer force? I'm going to bring Professor Kennedy back. Smart guy.
I think the principal worry about the all-volunteer force is precisely its capacity to be used without the civil society in whose name it fights having any very focused or felt interest in the actual use of the force. As long as we have an all-volunteer force, no one is required to pay attention, and no one is required to put their lives or their sons' and daughters' lives on the line.
So, do we have a good answer for that? I'm not sure. Is it resume the draft? I don't know. I wasn't too happy about it back when I was trying to get to med school. Should we just have a national service? Should every kid who graduates high school, like in France, have some kind of national service? Could be Teach for America, could be the Conservation Corps, could be anything. Should we have the AVF? I don't know. Something we got to think about. But I have to digress. I told you I like to bring certain people into these talks because they're unique and special. And this is about a fellow Marine. Anybody ever hear of this name? Who's Smedley Butler? I see a couple of hands. Does my history major know who he is? Uh-oh. Who's Smedley Butler, the most highly decorated Marine in history? Wow. You should know about him.
Smedley Butler was one of the most decorated Marines of the 20th century. Butler was born in 1881 to a wealthy Quaker family near Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
Not supposed to fight.
In 1898, he lied about his age and joined the Marine Corps at the age of 16 to fight in Cuba in what's often known as the Spanish-American War against the Spanish Empire. And from there, he participated in basically every U.S. invasion, occupation, overseas war from 1898 until the 1930s. The wars that Butler fought in are wars that most Americans have never heard of. They're wars like the Philippine-American War, when the United States colonized the islands of the Philippines. The U.S. invasions and occupations of Nicaragua, Honduras, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, the U.S. conquest of Puerto Rico, the U.S. invasion of Mexico, 1914. Butler participated in not one, but two invasions of China.
Wow, right? What kind of awards did he get? 16 medals back in the day when it was hard to get one. 5 were for heroism under fire. He's the only Marine ever awarded the Marine Corps Brevet Medal, and he has 2 Medals of Honor. Very unique. They're all for separate actions. And then he retires. You know what happens when you retire? You get a chance to start thinking about stuff. That's why I'm up here, right? He had an epiphany. So what did he say? He says, our boys were sent off to die with beautiful ideals painted in front of them. No one told them that dollars and cents were the real reason they were marching off to kill and die. Cuba was out about cane sugar. Nicaragua and Guatemala were about the United Fruit Company. You know, it goes on. And, you know, he finally realizes, why was I was following orders, but, you know, it was crazy. So he wrote a book called War is a Racket. It's not a hard read. It's only about 50 pages. And he documents all the business things that he realized he was doing. You know, it was kind of interesting. He says, I spent 33 years in active military service. And during that period, I spent most of my time as high-class muscle for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. So he kind of repudiated his own career, and he said, I'm not doing that. But an interesting thing happens. And he's retired, and this is what has me worried. He was recruited for a military coup against Roosevelt. Most of you have never heard of that. Right? A lot of stuff they didn't teach you in high school.
Did you know there was once a secret plan to overthrow the U.S. government? Yeah, in 1933, a group of powerful businessmen allegedly plotted to remove President Franklin D. Roosevelt and install a fascist regime. It's called the Business Plot, and it's one of the wildest, least talked about events in American history. At the time, the country was deep in the Great Depression. FDR's New Deal had just launched, and some wealthy elites weren't happy about it. They feared he'd shift the country too far left and hurt their profits. So a group of influential financiers and corporate leaders allegedly approached retired Marine Corps General Smedley Butler. Their pitch? Lead an army of 500,000 veterans, stage a coup, and take control of the White House. But they picked the wrong guy. Instead of joining the plot, Butler reported the entire plan to Congress. He testified in 1934, exposing the names and details.
Pretty amazing guy. He spent his last days fighting against fascism, the military-industrial complex, and all the things that, you know, he had basically been a leader in. It was even on the news several times. I'm not going to run through this documentary, but, you know, he gets on and does broadcasts of the new technology called television and movies, and he was on there. So the thing that we worry about, he was worried about a coup, right? Could there be a military coup? Well, President Kennedy read 7 Days in May shortly after it was published, and he believed the scenario could actually happen. And he told the Pentagon, the movie should be made, even though you guys don't want it made. We're going to let them make this movie. One of my favorite actors, one of my favorite movies. And it resonates today.
Mr. President, there's a military plot to take over the government.
Also a Navy
veteran. May occur
veteran.
sometime this coming Sunday.
There are some who will say it can never happen here. But this is the story of how it could happen. In 7 days of intrigue, of blackmail, of terror, an eternity of suspense. This is the astounding story of a military plot to overthrow the government of the United States, which, if successful, would change the fate of every American.
So I'm going to skip ahead because we've got some other things to cover, but I want to take a 2-minute break if anybody has a question. We're not done, George. We got a few minutes, so just letting you know. Anybody got a question or a comment? But I got a couple more slides. I got some things we got to cover. So, yes, ma'am. Mike's coming. Hold on.
This is incredible. And I'm just wondering, how much time did you put into making this? And I speak as an educator.
Okay, well, thank you for asking that question. Let me tell you when we're done, but let's just say it takes a lot of time. Even just putting captions on the documentaries so that those of us who don't hear well, takes me time to caption. Although I've learned how to use AI a little bit so that I don't have to do it all one finger at a time, you know. But great question, thank you. Anybody else have something that, yes ma'am.
Thank you so far. I had the idea there were, for some reason, a lot of poor minorities in the armed services.
Yes, that's true. The question is about minorities in the armed services. Yes, there is a fraction. I can't give you stats because they're not available today. There are people who are from minority groups, but there's this tendency right now to go this other direction. So, but yeah, minorities are represented. The chief of the the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was an African American general. He was very talented. Trump fired him right out of the gate just because. And I hate to think about why. Why did he fire him? And you count, it's just, you're right, there are some minorities. I see another question.
So it appears that the president. Hello? It appears that the president has what we might call 5 or 6 pocket justices in the Supreme Court. So you have the Insurrection Act and you have the Posse Comitatus Act, which seem to operate in contradictory or counterbalancing ways. This court has given Trump almost unfettered power to declare national emergencies on multiple levels, even though it might be a mosquito bite and a pimple. That suddenly is a national emergency. So what is the counterbalance to him continuing to have this sort of license to declare an emergency and send the troops in for whatever his purposes are?
What a great question. The Supreme Court's in his pocket. They've granted him total immunity for whatever he does. We're going to come talk about that. There's more. That's an interesting subject. Yeah, he can do whatever he wants. Yes, sir. Mike Cummins.
Yes, my feeling is, I do not know the military, but I have a feeling that they do not all march exactly to the same beat, to the same drummer. And I'm wondering, with some of the unorthodox uses of the military, or at least proposed uses, if this is not going to create a split within the military, particularly among the top leaders of the military. And then secondly, I was very disturbed about, and this is a little off subject, very disturbed about destroying that boat off Venezuela.
Hold that thought.
I'll back up. I'm sorry, I didn't mean that.
The question is about, are troops going to disobey legal orders and say, I'm not firing on the crowd? We're getting there. So good question. Good question. Any unfired rounds? One more. Last question. There'll be more time.
I was just curious if you could comment on General Milley and how he defied the president and his actions in the waning days of the first Trump presidency.
What a great question. You're asking about General Mark Milley, who is a scholar and a warrior and chairman of the Joint Chiefs and fired by President Trump. I'll show you the answer. So in all my talks, we always say there's just one more thing. And so,
now are we done? No, actually, there's one more thing.
So we have an unfired round, and you've kind of been circling around it. What's our unfired round? Will federal troops fire on civilian demonstrators? Will they obey illegal orders that I would consider illegal orders? Democracy is in danger. So what's the outcome? I'm going to quote from an ancestor. I told you I love old movies. This is a scholarly ancestor. He's going to give you the scholarly answer.
I'll tell you. I don't know.
You have to have a little humor in these talks because it's stressful. So in 2020, to get to that question about the general, we'll come there. Do you remember there was a riot in Washington, D.C.? The police were out, National Guard was out, the orange clown runs across the street with the Bible, and his security team has it upside down because he doesn't know how to read. And what does he do? Well, what does he say? We can hear from Mark Esper, who is a qualified Secretary of Defense for the most part.
No justice, no peace.
During the late spring of 2020, it was not a foreign crisis, but the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis that Esper calls a turning point in his time as Secretary of Defense. On the night of May 31st in Washington, protests for racial justice were marred by rioters who set parts of Washington ablaze. And Esper says enraged President Trump. Esper told us the commander-in-chief was on the verge of ordering 10,000 active duty troops into the streets of the Capitol.
The president is ranting at the room
He's using a lot of, foul language. You all are effing losers, right? He's going to finally give a direct order to deploy paratroopers into the streets of Washington, D.C., and I'm thinking with weapons and bayonets. And this would be horrible. Can't you just shoot them? Just shoot them in the legs or something. And he's suggesting that that's what we should do, that we should bring in the troops and shoot the protester.
This is during the last administration when we had really good senior officers in cabinet officers. They're all gone. Now they're replaced by TV hosts and loyalists and clowns. I couldn't have picked this cabinet for a Saturday Night Live skit if I was trying to do I mean, they are all wackos, but we'll get to that. 2020, there were stand-up guys who wouldn't allow it, like Mark Esper. This is one of them. One of my heroes. He made a few mistakes. There's 4 other guys that you'll see on this news clip. A couple of them are my friends. It's pretty cool.
Ben Tracy reports he's one of a growing number of retired military leaders criticizing the president.
We have a constitution, and we have to follow that constitution. And the president's drifted away from it.
President Trump's response to protests across the country has top former military commanders speaking out.
Our military should never be called to fight our own people as enemies of the state.
The criticism comes after President Trump talked about using the military to dominate the streets.
Oh, stand by. So you asked about General Milley. Great guy. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Gives this great commencement speech at West Point, which I'm going to play a bit of because it's great.
But we can come here. We can see the relics and hear the stories through the eyes and the voices of the individual soldiers who endured so much for the cause of freedom and their unrelenting devotion to the Constitution of the United States, the moral North Star for all of us in uniform. It is that document that gives purpose to our service. It is that document that gives purpose to this museum. And we in uniform are willing to die to pass it on to the next generation. In it are the ideas and the values that make up this experiment called the United States of America. And the motto of the United States Army for over 200 years, since 14 June 1775, the motto has been, "This we will defend." And the "this" refers to the Constitution and to protect the liberty of the American people. You see, we are unique among armies. We are unique among militaries. We do not take an oath to a king or a queen, a tyrant or a dictator. We do not take an oath to an individual. No, we do not take an oath to a country, a tribe, or a religion. We take an oath to the Constitution. And every soldier that is represented in this museum, every sailor, airman, Marine, Coast Guardsman, each of us will protect and defend that document regardless of personal price.
The last stand-up guy, they fired him right away. So, 2025 is not 2020. All those guys are gone. Senior military leaders are dismissed and replaced with the fawning loyalists. Pete Hegseth, totally unqualified. Right-wing TV celebrities. Tulsi Gabbard, Director of National Intelligence. She's like a Russian talking point. They laud the president in cabinet meetings. It's sort of like watching the cabinet in North Korea talking about, Kim Jong-un. It's terrible. The other thing is the military is supposed to be apolitical. If we were at some kind of an assembly and there was a speaker, there and somebody was there to talk to the group, you would sit politely or stand politely, and at the end, you would applaud. But something very ominous is happening that's changed the tenor of what's going on. And this is very frightening. It's supposed to be apolitical, but what are you going to see here?
And before going further, I want to say a few words about the situation in Los Angeles, California, where I've deployed thousands of National Guard troops and hundreds of Marines to protect federal law enforcement from the attacks of a vicious and violent mob. Generations of Army heroes did not shed their blood on distant shores only to watch our country be destroyed by invasion and third world lawlessness here at home, like is happening in California. As Commander-in-Chief, I will not let that happen. It's never going to happen.
Now I'm going to divide you. He's going to vilify other people. That's how you divide the population, right?
Yet, I would say even dumber than men playing in women's sports, transgender for everyone.
It's a big cultural issue, right? You got to target and demean people, and it gets crazier.
Grossly unfit president who listened to whoever was operating the auto pen.
Like he signed all 1,600 of those guys that got out of jail free on January 6th. So ultimately, military troops will tend to follow orders. So there's some of my colleagues here, and we'll have this discussion tonight. Can they resist the illegal order to shoot demonstrators? It's pretty hard because you can get court-martialed, you get arrested, you get court-martialed. But maybe we'll see history repeat itself. Some of you are my age. Maybe you remember this. Maybe you don't even need an order to fire on the demonstrators.
On May 4th, 1970, the Ohio National Guard opened fire on students protesting the Vietnam War, leaving 4 students dead. Kent Mayor Leroy Satrum declared a civil emergency and called in the Ohio National Guard. By May 3rd, 1,200 National Guardsmen occupied the Kent State campus. By noon, nearly 3,000 students had congregated in the university commons, 500 protesting, 1,000 cheering, and 1,500 watching.
No orders were given to open fire that day, but what happened?
28 of the guardsmen who had retreated up a hill fired between 61 and 67 shots. 4 students were killed. Victims Jeffrey Glenn Miller and Allison B. Krause were protesting, and William Knox Schroeder and Sandra Lee Scheuer were just bystanders. All were between 19 and 20 years old, and they were students in good standing. 9 other students were also injured.
First time I ever walked out of a class when I shouldn't have. But
a famous photo of a 14-year-old runaway kneeling over one of the students who had been shot and killed. This photo would become a symbol of the climate of America during the Vietnam War.
Polls at the time showed most Americans blamed the demonstrators, not the Guard.
Interesting, huh? So if I were still in uniform, I'd be swearing like a sailor. But, you know, I went and joined an anti-war demonstration that afternoon. I couldn't stand it. So this week, let's fast forward to this week. I like to bring these things up to date. Trump orders a killing at sea. Somebody asked about that. Who did they kill? Do we know who they killed? I don't know who they killed. What was their crime? Allegedly, maybe smuggling drugs. Do we have any proof? I don't know. Was there a trial? Did they have due process? Did we follow what's pretty standard in America? I'm astounded. You're an SBU 11, right? You back me up on this. We're going to talk about it.
President Trump confirmed that the U.S. launched a strike in the southern Caribbean against a Venezuelan vessel that was allegedly carrying drugs.
I was trained and qualified as a river and coastal patrol officer.
The president said the boat was operated by a well-known gang.
Normally, you stop the boat, you assess, you do an investigation.
And that 11 people were killed during that operation.
They killed unknown people, no due process. It's murder. I haven't heard hardly anything from anybody in Congress or anybody that said this is murder. They didn't notify Congress. They didn't get permission. You know, bombing the nuclear reactors in Iran should have been, talked about by Congress leadership. So, we call this an extrajudicial killing. I guess if he can kill people in a speedboat in the Caribbean, could happen to any of us. So this lecture has led me into some dark moments in our history. I find this stuff very hard to fathom, but the good news is, if I can bring in good news, this country, even when it had terrible issues like slavery or whatever, we always eventually were able to correct. But right now, I really worry about the erratic White House occupant. As far as I'm concerned, he's nuts. His sycophants who push autocracy, the militarization of law enforcement agencies, guys with masks, when they sweep people off the street, that's what they do in Russia. We don't do that here. This is crazy. Law enforcement guys should have name tags and badges and you know, see who they are. But no, they're masked and they don't have any name tags. So what's my final message? Unlike Tevye, I think future events will result in calling up the National Guard or the active military for more over and over. I wrote this before the LA occupation, by the way, last year. Senior leaders were previously scholars who followed rules and upheld the Constitution. Generals Mattis, Milley, Petraeus, Stavridis, Admiral Mullen, friends of mine. But now you got a lawless president with his masked marauders pulling people off the street, putting them in concentration camps. I'm pretty sure that today's military would fire on demonstrators with or without orders. I see a lot of bullies in the street. You see them beat up a lot of these people, just because. The military and law enforcement have become political tools. Anyone could be arrested without any reason, perhaps killed, as we just saw on that video, without a real reason, and no one in Congress said a word. So, been a privilege to talk to you about this. It's a hard topic. The use and misuse, the role of the military in our society. I want to thank you all for joining me, and I'm going to open the floor for questions. So, Joy? And the mic will go around if you have a hand to raise, and thank you, George.
Right. And I have a survey that I want to do, something that you said makes me want to ask. So how many people are of age that they were subject to the draft? Okay, keep your hands up. Okay. Okay. Now, how many of you got the draft number of under 100?
Me. Two of us. Mike and I.
And what was your number?
It was 74, I think.
74.
Mine was 5.
Mine was 1. So
you didn't go to med school. How'd you do that?
What?
You didn't go to med school.
No, I didn't go. Watergate actually saved me. He didn't call anybody at my year that I was up. But the reason I asked was I was starting to wonder, after you said that you had a 5, that maybe a low draft number created interest in the whole subject of how the military is used. So I was wrong.
Good point, though.
But I thought I'd try it. Okay, so now we'll have questions. Joy, you want to?
Sure. And I'm going to make one comment. You had asked about minorities in the military. Did you notice who was behind President Trump at Fort Bragg, North Carolina? I don't think I saw a minority, but I didn't look at the whole big crowd. But, the TV camera focused in on a bunch of guys that look like Pete Hegseth. I don't know what else to tell you. Anyway, anybody have a question? Joy. Make them.
I was just going to say in the video, like directly behind him, it's an African American man.
And what's the population of this country?
Well, I don't know, but I'm saying
there's one. Yeah, that's correct. But that's not the military. It's probably more like 15 or 18%.
Hispanics.
There's probably a few
behind him.
Yeah, but they were pretty careful picking their audience. That was not representative.
I mean, I'm not disagreeing with your presentation or anything like that. I'm disagreeing with that one statement. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah. No, that's okay. And that's a good thing to disagree about. But I think those were handpicked guys. And if you look at the memos and emails and stuff that went back and forth, there was this tremendous thing about we have to pick guys who look a certain way. And they didn't exactly say it. But that you see what we got. There's not just 1 out of 100 African Americans in uniform at Fort Bragg.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it was definitely slanted. But great point. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so I understand you saying the hope of many people was that were the shit to hit the fan, there would be military leaders who would say no.
There used to be.
So you're really saying they aren't there anymore?
Okay, so the question has to do with the military leaders who said no to Trump during the first administration. So since January 20th, the 8 top people in leadership in the Pentagon, Army, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard, whatever, they were all fired. And he brought in loyalists. And part of the loyalist test, believe it or not, you're going to find out soon because there is discovery underway for the FBI agents who were fired. Part of the loyalist test is, who did you vote for in the last election? You're going to see all this in the news. It's coming up pretty soon. So yeah, they fired all the people that they had any concern about, and they brought in loyalists who could pass the test.
But there are a lot of officers all over.
Right, so there's no longer a competitive way of doing it like we used to do it. you know, and now he can pick, and he picks who he wants, and they have to pass a loyalty test, and it's very frightening because they won't say no. And the other part of that equation, which is something you have to think about, is, you know, the guys who fired on that boat in the Caribbean, you know, they got an order to go attack this thing, and they're not going to, you know, go to their leadership and go, is this legal? Right? That's not what you do. You got an order, you follow the order because you assume you're getting it from lawful authority that has the best interests of the American people at heart. It's a very tough subject, but a lot of the scholarly guys like Mark Milley, General Milley, are gone, and you know they're replaced by TV hosts and you know other loyalists. Anybody else? You get to pick.
Do you think he'll only be one term?
Like my ancestor says, I don't know. Is he going to be one term? I'm very, very alarmed that this demonstration with the National Guard and the Marine Corps will take place during the next election, and it may be the last election. Seriously. We may have had the last presidential election. You know, he's calling out the National Guard to see what we'll tolerate. And so far we're tolerating the National Guard. The Marines. You don't send the Marines to LA for a little demonstration. The Marines, you know, have one job, which is to close with the enemy and kill them. Yes, sir.
Hi. I'm asking, or I'm curious what the potential backstop could be. So Congress is silent, and the military, obviously, leadership is under the realm of the leader of, you know, POTUS. And then you have ICE in places like my hometown, Chicago. So I'm kind of curious about how this is, like, what is the backstop in this scenario?
What a great question. I'm giving a lecture on that in Lafayette on the 30th. So you're right. The Supreme Court's in his pocket. They gave Trump full immunity. Congress checked their testicles at the door. They don't say a thing. You know, we don't hear anything about the War Powers Act. ICE has now got a bigger budget and more personnel than the U.S. Marine Corps. Staggering thought. Can you imagine? Guys in masks, you know, balaclavas, sweeping people off the street. Boy, they arrested those dangerous workers at the battery plant, you know, at the Hyundai factory, right? What's the backstop? If I have to say that there's hope, the backstop is everybody in this room and everybody we all know, and we have to shut down the country. You know, Congress, if there's anybody in Congress with a heart and a soul and a brain and a testicle, they have to stop the funding of the government on September 30th. And just like they did in France this week when they were upset, they struck the trains, they struck the buses, they struck the airlines, they struck everything, and they shut the country down. And it's worked before. You know, it worked in Gdansk, Poland, you know, when they, you know, cracked the Soviet control in the shipyards. They shut down the country. We're going to have to shut down the country to get some control. And that's going to be hard. And by the way, I believe in nonviolent protest. So, you know, well, I don't know if we're going to be able to do that.
Yeah. What do they teach in those military academies with regard to what you're just talking about?
Oh, what a great question. So the military academies, you know, the Air Force Academy, the Army at West Point, the Navy Academy, you know, they're at Annapolis. They're there to teach the officer corps of the future, the young officers, and they teach the law of war. But have you noticed lately, Tom Hanks was going to be given an award at West Point for being, you know, so much for veterans. You know, besides being the, you know, best actor I've ever seen in some of these movies, you know, he was going to get an award, but you know, he criticized President Trump, so they withdrew his award. So just like we're seeing in other aspects of the military, you have to pass a loyalty test, and it's getting a little tighter and tighter for these guys. And then you got to remember, this is the young officer corps passing the loyalty test, and you know, what is it for the 18 or 19-year-old kid from Arkansas or Alabama or Georgia? You know, did he attend a lot of classes on the law of war and, you know, those kinds of things? So, yeah, so at the top it's being squeezed away, and at the bottom they're probably just not getting the information. Do we have any other questions, George? Do we need to?
Time for one more question, and then we'll take the discussion.
And I'll hang around. I'll hang around.
Go ahead, Joe. You can pick the last one.
Pick the white hair. Oh, she's showing favorites.
No, I was persistent. I was persistent. What are the grounds on which you can say, I refuse to obey that order?
Well, great question. Can I
That's-
refuse to obey that order?
Yes, on the grounds.
Well, in this environment, somebody with a balaclava covering up their identity will throw you in a cell, and you'll be tried for treason. So it's going to get harder and harder.
The question is there a legal answer?
Yes, there is a legal answer, and yes, they can, and they should, and they don't. You know, do you remember Lieutenant Calley in Vietnam? You know, we're old enough for some of the. There's a lot of things that get swept under the rug. I thought after Rodney King we'd never see anything like George Floyd, but sometimes history repeats itself, and I think we're going to see guys who fail their loyalty test or who don't want to follow that illegal order. And remember, a lot of these guys aren't sophisticated, having gone to the academy, so maybe their lieutenant or their captain knows it's an illegal order, but they're going to go tell the guy to burn the village. They go burn the village. So yeah, I think we're in deep trouble, but I'm going to hang around. We're going to talk. We're going to do some groups. We're going to have some discussion because we have some different opinions in the room, and I think that's important to remember. Whatever party we're in, whatever religion we follow, whatever demographic we come from, we're all Americans, and we're all in this together, and we all want it to go forward and be successful as a country. So thank you again for your time. George?
So as we mentioned, we'll have the discussions afterward. There's also things to eat and drink. And so ends another event at the Commonwealth Club in its 124th year of enlightened discussion. And I liked what you said, the last thing. We all have different opinions, because if we're going to try to keep democracy, you have to remember that you don't replace one point of view with just another point of view when you do that. You replace it with everyone's point of view and come to a consensus. Remember that?
You bet. Consensus, collaboration, consensus.
So thank you very much for coming, and hope to see you again.